Hello, my name's Lisa Maria Muller. I'm Head of Research at the Chartered College of Teaching, and together with my colleague Vic Cook, we're presenting our Cognitive Science in Education Teachers' Priorities for Research report today. The Chartered College of Teaching is the professional body for teachers, and we work on bringing practice and research more closely together through our work. I will now hand over to my colleague Vic, who will take us through the first part of this presentation.
Thank you, Lisa Maria. So today then, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at an overview of why we chose to focus on cognitive science. Then we're going to be thinking a little bit about what exactly is a research priority setting activity and why we chose to use it for our purposes today. Talking briefly about the aims and methodology of the process that we went through, and then Lisa Maria will be talking about the findings and how you can get involved from here. So why did we choose to focus on cognitive science? A recent report from the EEF noted that whilst findings from basic cognitive science, i.e. using experiments under controlled conditions, provide us with a really good theoretical understanding of how learning works, evidence from applied cognitive science, i.e. cognitive science that's actually been applied in the classroom, is more limited. So whilst there is quite a lot of evidence from cognitive science in the classroom, only a tiny fraction of these studies actually test cognitive science in realistic classroom conditions. Many of the studies are small, so with fewer than 100 pupils, and most strategies have only been tested in a limited number of subjects, typically maths and science, and often with pupils in key stages 2 to 4. And many of the studies are really short, so just a few weeks or less, making it harder to judge long-term retention. Where large-scale studies in realistic classroom conditions have been conducted, they've shown tiny and often mixed effects that contrast quite markedly with the impressive effect sizes seen in the basic science, which raises important questions about the educational variables that teachers must be dealing with when implementing cognitive science strategies in their classroom. So thinking about the curriculum, professional development, how the strategies are linked to other aspects of teaching, such as assessment, differences in pupil motivation, needs and prior learning, all of these things that teachers need to consider in their day-to-day practice. So currently, we don't really have a strong understanding of how the basic science relating to cognition and memory translate into everyday classroom teaching and learning across phases and across subject areas. So if we think about evidence-informed practice and what we at the Chartered College understand by that, I think it's really important to understand that we don't see use of evidence in teaching as a top-down process. There's sort of 3 spheres to evidence-informed practice, and it's at the overlap of those spheres that we believe evidence-informed practice really sits. So whilst we do have a large amount of evidence from basic cognitive science, research evidence, we also have to balance this with the decisions that teachers as experts in their own classroom, executing their own professional judgment, make on a daily basis about all of those different educational variables that we talked about previously, as well as understanding the contextual specific nature of the intervention of that might be taking place. And that can be all the way from the individual up to the system level. And if we think about that intersection, that is really what we mean by evidence-informed practice at the Chartered College. And we think that given all the questions and uncertainties surrounding implementing the findings from cognitive science that teachers will have, it's important to look at these questions and think about how they can be used to narrow the research practice gap. So really thinking about the importance of teacher voice and how we can ensure that future research into cognitive science is really relevant for practical experience in the classroom. So at the Chartered College of Teaching, we seek to empower a knowledgeable and respected teaching profession through membership and accreditation. And we recognise the crucial role that teachers play in the process of adapting and implementing research evidence to make it fit for their students in their classrooms. And we think we are well placed to bring research and practice closer together to ensure that it's both academically rigorous and practically relevant, and really facilitate that dialogue between researchers and practitioners. So we chose to implement a research priority setting activity to try and bridge this gap. Now, it's frequently, this approach is frequently used in healthcare, and the aim in healthcare is to establish a consensus among knowledge users and researchers to help shape the research agenda. And often research priorities are then shared with funders and researchers and other interested parties to try and identify where future research should be conducted to have the biggest impact. To our knowledge, they have a very limited use in education, and no studies focusing on cognitive science research have actually been conducted. So again, thinking about how we can elevate the voice of teachers to help bridge that research practice divide was really our justification in choosing to conduct this research priority setting activity, which very much aligns with the new approaches to teacher professionalism that position teachers as agents of change rather than subjects to change. So the aims of the priority setting partnership then were to find out what unanswered questions exist about the implementation of findings from the cognitive sciences in practice, to generate a prioritised list of these uncertainties, and to share these results to raise awareness about these questions and uncertainties with those who are conducting the research, and communicate these findings also to those who are funding the research. So there are lots of different methods, models and frameworks used for generating research priorities in healthcare, but we chose to follow an adapted version of the James Lind Alliance approach, which is a particular approach that aims to bring clinicians, carers and patients together on an equal footing to identify and prioritise unanswered questions or evidence uncertainties that relate to a specific area. So, for example, a study relating to asthma or studies relating to asthma. And then they would produce a top 10 list of important areas for future research. And we actually aim to collaboratively identify the top 15 research priorities relating to the use and perceived effectiveness of cognitive science research across subjects, phases, students and learning contexts. It's important to note here, though, that our focus is on the lived experience of teachers rather than students, and therefore we've chose to focus on teachers in this particular research priority setting activity. So to establish this 15 list of priorities, we went through a rigorous process. We established a steering committee that helped to guide the development of the survey and refine the list of the final priorities. That consisted of a mix of practitioners from across different phases, all of whom were Chartered College of Teaching members, and also 8 academics. We gained ethical approval from the CCT Research Ethics Panel, and we developed an online survey that was based on the EEF systematic review of cognitive science approaches in the classroom. And that review focused on specific strategies such as spaced learning, interleaving, retrieval practice, managing cognitive load, etc. So what we did was we asked 3 priming questions that were specifically geared to teachers' current use of each of these different strategies. And then if they reported using them, we also asked them about their levels of confidence in using that particular strategy, as well as their perceived effectiveness of that strategy. And then following these priming questions, we then asked them to submit up to 3 questions or uncertainties about any questions they have implementing findings from the cognitive science in their classroom. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Lisa Maria, who will talk through the results.
Thank you very much, Vic. So we had a total of 383 respondents submitting their questions to the survey and replying to the questions. 76% of them were members of the Chartered College of Teaching, 83% had a minimum of 10 years of teaching experience, and 42% were classroom teachers, 26% were middle leaders, 27% senior leaders, and the remaining were, for example, consultants or working in initial teacher training. As you will note from this graph, if you're very quick at doing maths in your head, that the numbers don't add up to the 383 total respondents. This is because in our experience conducting research at the Chartered College of Teaching, because we focus on the whole teaching profession, it is very difficult to make teachers select just one phase they teach in, especially in the early years in primary and secondary and sixth form, when very often teachers teach across phases. So we asked them to select all categories, all phases that apply to them. So we can see here that we had an overrepresentation out of those who provided information, overrepresentation for secondary, but that's not surprising given that the vast majority of research in this area does stem from secondary, and so probably teachers might feel that it's more applicable to them if they work in a secondary education with older students. As Vic said, we initially asked 3 priming questions where we asked teachers about their cognitive science strategy use, so which of these strategies they're currently using in the classroom. And as you can see here, the most common strategies that have been used by our participants are retrieval practice and strategies to manage cognitive load, which is not surprising given their prominent place in the recent Ofsted framework and also, of course, in the golden thread of the early career framework and other recent publications. Least commonly used is embodied learning. Again, it is likely that this is due to the prominence of these different strategies in some guidance documents. But what we can see from here as well is that most strategies are widely used by our participants, giving us the idea that they are indeed trying to implement these different strategies, making their questions and quite informed, which is what we were trying to get at. So it's important to note that we're not claiming that these questions are representative of the whole teaching profession. Rather, we were looking for a sample of teachers who are already using some of these strategies in their classroom and have thus got informed questions and uncertainties about their use in their classrooms. When we asked them about the level of confidence, again, the most widely used strategies, retrieval practice and managing cognitive load, were also the ones where teachers indicated the highest level of confidence, with embodied learning being reported with the lowest level of confidence overall. And finally, when we asked them about the perceived effectiveness, again, we had managing cognitive loads. It's interesting, retrieval practice that were perceived as most effective. And then we had a decrease. So what the overall picture here is that overall teachers are using the strategies that they perceive to be most effective and that they are most confident in using. And with the others, there might be more uncertainties about their implementation. So in total, we received 424 questions from teachers. So remember that they could submit up to 3 questions. We removed 22 due to a lack of relevance. So either they weren't related to cognitive sciences, they were just general questions about teaching, or how other teaching approaches interacted with cognitive science. So that was our criterion, that they had to relate to cognitive science directly, or at least how other teaching strategies interact with the cognitive sciences. Or sometimes simply the formulation was unclear, so we weren't able to include the question in the analysis. That means that we were left with a final corpus of 402 questions, which we turned into 58 collated questions and final 15 priorities. In a final report, you will find both the 58 collated questions and the 15 final priorities. What you will notice is that the 15 final priorities are, of course, a lot more general, whereas the 58 collated questions really drill down into each of these different strategies that we asked teachers about and ask quite specific questions. So if you are a researcher looking to, say, conduct research into retrieval practice or interleaving, these questions might help guide your thinking around the type of research you might want to conduct. We conducted a top-level inductive analysis. Both Vic and I had a look at the questions separately and then brought them together and developed a coding framework that focused on implementation, students and teachers. Now, we said at the beginning, of course, that we wanted to focus on the implementation of cognitive science strategies in the classroom. So it's no surprise that the vast majority of questions did indeed relate to that particular topic. But we also noticed 2 sub-themes relating to students and in particular their motivation or their individual application of these strategies in their individual learning, and teachers, their attitudes towards using these different cognitive science strategies or their confidence in using them. So we decided to split the 15 priorities into these 3 different themes. Now, when we look at the first topic, I will give you some time to read through this. And rather than focusing on all of these questions, I'd like to pull out questions 3 and 4, namely how do different cognitive science strategies interact with each other and other teaching strategies during the learning process. So this particular question really highlights the complexity of teaching, doesn't it? Because it shows that teaching is never just about one teaching strategy, as effective as it might be. It always requires the careful combination of multiple teaching strategies, whether they stem from the cognitive sciences or other, for example, subject-specific strategies. So a lot of the questions related to how these strategies might be combined. How do you combine retrieval practice and interleaving most effectively? How does this affect other areas? How does this combine with, say, subject-specific methodologies and pedagogies? And so we've thought that it would be, that's important to highlight this particular question. Sorry, I skipped over question 1. What does the effective implementation of different cognitive science strategies look like across different phases, subjects, and student groups, especially for younger students, practical subjects, and students with SEND? The submitted questions, therefore, really emphasized and supported what was found in the EEF report authored by Perry and colleagues, which highlighted the need for more research in subjects other than maths and science with younger students and students with special educational needs. And that really came through in questions submitted by teachers. And then the 4th area focused on the optimal frequency of different cognitive science strategies for best outcome. So a lot of teachers were asking about, especially retrieval practice, and whether the fact that it has been found to be effective meant that they should be starting, say, every lesson with retrieval practice, whether there was a plateau at some point. And we don't really know at the moment, because we haven't really tested these strategies in the context of the curriculum, in the context of a whole school day. But that seems to be a very prevalent, important question amongst teachers who, of course, need to plan their school day, their weeks, according to what we know about the most effective use of these strategies. Let us move on to the second part of implementation, and again, I will give you some time to read through the questions. Again, I would like to pick up 2 questions. The first one being, how can teachers effectively adapt cognitive science strategies as students move along the novice to expert continuum in the learning? So for those of you who are familiar with cognitive load theory, it speaks a lot about experts and novices and them not requiring the same strategy. So the same strategy is not being effective for experts and novices, with novices requiring a lot more guidance and scaffolding, which then can fade when you're working with experts. However, of course, our teachers are not working with novices on the one hand and then experts on the other, but they're working with students who are on that continuum, moving from novice to expert within a subject, within sub areas of a subject, and within even the same classroom. So their questions related to how they could best navigate the grey area between novice to expert, which shows a really clear understanding of the fact that they know that different strategies are required for these student groups according to their expertise. However, of course, there is a grey area when they're moving from one to the other, and they were wondering what strategies would be best adapted to supporting students across that continuum. And then another question I'd like to highlight relates to cognitive science strategies and how they're best implemented to ensure a balance between appropriate cognitive load and challenge. Again, this sort of relates to the expert-novice continuum, this idea that we shouldn't be overburdening students with cognitive load, with extraneous cognitive load, but on the other hand, we do want to challenge them. So what does that look like in practice and for different subjects and for different students with different needs? That came across as an important question. Let us move on to students and teachers now. Again, I'll give you some time to read through the questions. Let us start with the questions about students and picking up one, namely the first one: how does the use of cognitive science strategies impact students' motivation? The question here being, again, slightly related to the frequency. What happens if we're using, is there such a thing as using one of these strategies too often, which might bore students? Some of these strategies can be a little bit repetitive, for example. What do we know about students' motivation when such strategies are being implemented in the classroom, and how can we ensure that teaching and learning remains motivating for students? And then in the teaching category, I'd like to pick out the third question: what is the optimal balance between fidelity to original research designs and teacher expertise in the context-specific application of cognitive science strategies? So, of course, from our perspective at the Chartered College of Teaching, questions relating to this particular topic were extremely interesting because they highlight that teachers are not simply implementing findings from research; they are adapting them to their context, and so they're asking whether what role the adaptation of different strategies in their context plays in terms of the subsequent effectiveness of these strategies. What is the role of fidelity and what is their role of teacher expertise? How much freedom do they have in adapting? And is it realistic for us to expect that teachers are simply going to implement a strategy that has been found to be effective in research? So overall, what we found, emerging themes are that teachers are interested in age and subject differences, not surprising given that what the report by the EEF found, and it's clearly come to the surface here that teachers need to know how these different strategies work across contexts. Lots of questions relating to the complexity of teaching, how and the interaction between cognitive science strategies and other teaching approaches at the macro and micro level. So what we mean here we're talking here about the lesson level. How am I meant to combine these different strategies at the lesson level, but also at the curriculum level and even at the school level? So we need to start to reflect at the school level, for example, whether the implementation of a particular strategy as the requirements in each and every lesson might impact student motivation, might impact even their attainment. Lots of questions about frequency and how often teachers are meant to apply these different strategies, what is effective, whether there is a plateau at some point or maybe even a decline. We mentioned the expert versus novice continuum and the grey zones there and how difficult it is for teachers to navigate those. There are questions also about the measuring of the effectiveness. How are teachers meant to measure the effectiveness of these strategies in their context? We mentioned the impact on student motivation and agency. So can students use these strategies in their own independent learning, for example? And if so, how best to support them? And finally, questions on teacher development. How can teachers be supported to develop a good understanding of these strategies that still teaches them the importance of context-specific application and critical reflection? And finally, I'd like to note, if you're interested, how you as a research community can get involved with this work. We would really appreciate if you could share the 15 priorities and discuss them with your peers, with your colleagues. Maybe you can explore some of the questions in your own research if you're conducting research around the cognitive sciences in the classroom. And we would really appreciate if you shared your findings with us to help narrow the research practice gap further. Thank you very much for listening to us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us on research@chartered.college, and we'd be happy to arrange a call. Thank you very much.